It's 1919. We're in Versailles, and the peace that is supposed to mark the end of the Great War, the First World War, is taking place. One of the most important economists of the last century, John Maynard Keynes, whom we see in the image, is participating as a British delegate. He would propose something particularly innovative to help the world grow after the Great War, but the politicians attending the Congress don't agree. They have something else in mind. These politicians, from left to right, are the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, the Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, and the President of the United States of America Woodrow Wilson. The host is the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. We see him in the center of the photograph, and he's already set up to show just how dominant he is in the scene. He's in the center, he's confident, he knows what he wants, and the only thing he wants is the destruction of Germany. Keynes would later write in his memoirs that Clemenceau wanted a Carthaginian peace. Germany must be destroyed. On either side of him are the British Prime Minister, who will soon be facing elections and needs to present a peace agreement, one that aligns with the feelings of the British people, which are clearly feelings of revenge. While on the other side is the President of the United States, whom Keynes describes as a good man with good intentions, but who doesn't have an operational plan, so he falls victim to the others. And then there's the Italian Prime Minister, Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, who doesn't play a major role. In his memoirs, Keynes relegates him to a footnote. On the other hand, as a side note, we see that the Italian Prime Minister's jacket is the only one without tails and only tailcoats. Italy is the weakest of these powers. So we need to decide how to annihilate Germany, and we'll do it this way. Germany's sources of income and wealth are mainly two. One is international trade, which has made Germany very wealthy in recent years, but even more so, its energy sources, coal and steel, which Germany has used to finance and develop its industry. And this made it the second industrial power in Europe after England. At this point, an operational plan is needed to destroy these sources of income for Germany. All war debts will be charged to Germany, which is estimated at about $30 billion. Whether that's a high figure or not, it's hard for us to understand today. But all you have to do is make a comparison, the comparison with the GDP of the United States of America. At that time, the United States had an income of about $100 billion. So that means Germany is being asked to pay an amount equal to about a third of the entire GDP of the United States. It's an enormous sum that Germany will definitely not be able to pay, and yet they decide to saddle Germany with it. Then they also decide to take away part of Germany's territory, some of its colonies, and a portion of its population. In other words, all that wealth that had made it the second industrial power. And then they decide to take away Germany's entire fleet. Not just the military fleet, but unfortunately the merchant fleet as well. How does Germany respond? By making this proposal, saying they would pay a little less, $25 billion, not much less, but asking in return to keep their sources of income. We understand that placing the entire war debt on a single country, while taking away its possible sources of income, is economic madness. We must at least allow Germany to have an income so it can pay its debts. So the German proposal would be to pay a little less, not much less, actually. But to keep the population, the territory, the merchant fleet, basically all the sources of income that made it wealthy. There's also a proposal from Keynes along these lines, suggesting that the debts contracted between the Allied countries should be cancelled. After all, the war was clearly a mistake. Let's wipe the slate clean and build a future of economic growth together. To do this together, we need to create a common debt to raise funds, so that all the Allied countries can benefit from it and then pay it back when the countries are in a phase of growth. Basically, it's a common debt, what we would call Eurobonds today. These are Eurobonds 100 years before Eurobonds even existed. Keynes really had great foresight in this regard. Neither proposal would be accepted. The first, because to cancel a debt, you obviously need the creditor's approval. Who are the world's major creditors? mainly the United States of America and the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is willing to cancel its credits. In fact, Keynes goes so far as to propose giving up a significant amount of credits, the ones we see in the table. The British Empire is willing to cancel all of them. Is the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who wants peace so badly, willing to do the same? No, he is not. Peace is fine at any cost, as long as those costs are only theoretical. But when it comes to talking about real costs in terms of dollars, he stops at the threshold of cold, hard cash. Therefore, the United States of America rejects Keynes' proposal. They want their money back. So what do you do then? All the debt is effectively placed on Germany, which, in order to pay it, will have no choice but to print money that keeps losing value. And just how much less is this money worth? It's worth so much less that in Germany, in 1923, a small coin, like our euro cents, which are worth just a few cents, was issued, but it was worth 5 billion marks. You can see that if a small coin like that, which should be equivalent to 1 or 2 cents today, costs 5 billion marks, all prices in Germany are completely out of control. This is the time of the great German inflation, which will be fought by the central bank with a particularly restrictive policy and a very tough approach for the Germans. The government is trying to support the economy by paying workers a bit more than what the minimum wages would be, trying to pay industries to provide them with communication services, postal services, telegraphs, efficient railways, but all of this costs money. The money printed to pay off debts and to deal with the economic crisis drastically devalues the currency. At this point, all that's left is to understand how to get out of hyperinflation. And how do you do that? By granting credit to Germany. The United States had refused to cancel their credits towards Germany, but they were quite willing to grant new ones. For what strange economic reason would they do this? If I have a credit with someone and I decide to cancel it, I take a loss equal to the amount of the canceled credit. But if I keep lending money to this person, hoping that the money will be paid back, my credits aren't affected and my balance sheet stays unchanged. So the United States prefers to provide new money to Germany, believing that Germany will eventually be able to pay back its debts. This is a financing plan proposed by Mr. Dawes, which involves giving money to Germany to allow it to recover and reach a point where it can pay back its debts. Keynes argued that this would have been impossible. The debts were still too high. In fact, in contrast with the decisions made by the Versailles Committee, he decided to resign and return to London, where he wrote in a very short time a book that was very well known at the time, titled The Economic Consequences of the Peace. In this book, he listed everything that should have been done, but wasn't, during the peace negotiations at Versailles. The Dawes Plan, however, seems to work. Germany receives payments from the United States of America and is able to grow, to recover from the period of sharp decline from the period of high inflation. However, the overall debt has not been reduced. Those $30 billion still remain to be paid. These are addressed with a second financing plan. The Dawes Plan had worked so well that they tried to make another one. In fact, Mr. Dawes would receive the Nobel Peace Prize the following year for having tried to get Germany back on the right track. The next plan, the Young Plan, comes at a very unfortunate time, year 1929. At the beginning of 1929, they decided to provide new credit to Germany, but this credit will never arrive because in 1929 there's the great crash of the New York Stock Exchange and the United States enters a long period of recession. They're no longer able to support Europe's economy, so their loans are lost. And in 1932, at Lausanne, the European countries, during a conference, decided to cancel their debts with each other. That's exactly what Keynes had suggested a few years earlier, but no one wanted to do it, hoping that Germany would pay back its debts. And that was a realistically impossible feat. The following year, the United States of America had to face the harsh reality. The European countries wouldn't able to pay their debts to the United States. So it got to a point where the Treaty of Versailles had completely failed. The debts that were supposed to be paid aren't paid, Germany will never repay its debt, and Europe will never repay its debt either. And President Woodrow Wilson, who was so determined to keep his credits, will have to lose them as well. The mistakes made at Versailles would mark the entire 20 years leading up to the Second World War, which for many is an obvious consequence of the errors at Versailles. Let's take a look at them. At the Versailles peace talks, as we've seen, it was mainly the 4 countries that won the First World War who were present. What about the losers? They were left off to the side, waiting for the victors to decide something. Something that was perceived as revenge. And that's exactly what it was. They decided to destroy the German economy, assuming that the other countries could grow on their own. But you can't grow on your own. An economy can only grow if it opens up to other countries, ensuring lasting sources of income over time. So from this failed organization of peace at Versailles, we did learn something. And the lesson learned would be useful in deciding the peace after the Second World War, which we will see in the next episode.